8.3 million inhabitants, 32,000 streets, 5 boroughs, 3 rivers, which all together make up one city unlike any other on the planet. What's all the more remarkable is that, when you stop to consider, what makes the city so recognizable? Today, whether it be the iconic skyline, famous cultural offerings, or the energy of its streets, you realize that virtually everything that makes New York so renowned, the world over, simply did not exist, even as little as a century ago. That is because much of the city's history has been shaped by constant evolution, development and renewal, which has transformed New York unimaginably over the years. But how did this city, which started off as a small outpost for European traders just over 400 years ago, evolve into the sprawling mega metropolis that it is today? This is how New York became the world's greatest city long before the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers of modern-day New York. The area was full of dense forests, flowing rivers, and abundant wildlife. The land itself was home to groups of Algonquin-speaking Native American tribes, chief amongst which were the Lenape people, who lived in harmony with nature, hunting, fishing, and cultivating the land in an undisturbed manner for some 0 years, until the arrival of the first Europeans. The European exploration and colonization of the Americas began in earnest at the outset of the 16th century, as navigators from nations like Spain, France, and the Netherlands sought out new trade routes to these newly discovered and resource-rich territories. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the flag of France, became the first European to set eyes on the shore of what would one day become New York Harbor. Verrazzano claimed the area in the name of France. Although any attempt to follow this up with colonial settlement failed to materialize, it would be almost another 100 years before Europeans would return to the area, and it would be the Dutch who would ultimately leave. The first lasting impression on what would eventually become New York City in 1609, the English explorer Henry Hudson, who was in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, had been tasked with finding the elusive Northwest Passage purported to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Whilst on this expedition, Hudson sailed up the northern river of New York Harbor, which now bears his name in honor of his discovery. He claimed the land on either side on behalf of the Dutch Republic, and in the process established a foothold for future Dutch settlement and trade in the region. The following decades saw Dutch trading posts established along the banks of the Hudson River, as well as others dotted along the coastline, stretching from the Delaware River to Cape Cod, which formed the wider territorial claims of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Initially, these isolated dwellings and their occupants were focused entirely on the commerce produced by the fur trade. But in 1624, the Dutch West India Company decided to send a ship full of colonists to establish permanent civilian settlements in the region. They first landed on what is now Governor's Island, but were then dispersed amongst the chosen sites for settlement across New Netherland. A small group were disembarked on the southern tip of Manhattan, after it was decided to construct a fortification, this to protect the entrance to the Hudson River and the valuable cargoes of the fur trade which passed upon it, with that the foundations of Fort Amsterdam were laid out in 1625, and it quickly formed the epicenter of a new settlement which sprung up around it. New Amsterdam was born, and so tower the beginnings of New York City in the following year of 1626, with the hope of legitimizing their claim to the new colony. The Director General of New Netherland, Peter Minuit, purchased the land of Manhattan from a small band of local Lenape Indians in exchange for traded goods worth 60 guilders, roughly $1. Zero in today's money. From here, the colony began to grow, and under the Minuit successor, Peter Stuyvesant, its population reached some 1,500 people by the year 1655. However, Stuyvesant was widely disliked by the settlers for the policies that he introduced. These included regulations on alcohol sales, attempts to assert control over the Dutch Reformed Church, and the blocking of other religious groups such as Quakers, Jews, and Lutherans from establishing places of worship in the colony, the Dutch West India Company. He attempted to intervene by introducing more lenient policies and reform. However, these plans were quickly interrupted by the outbreak of war. In the latter half of the 17th century, the Netherlands was locked in a fierce rivalry with England to become the uncontested maritime and commercial superpower of the age. Between 1652 and 1673, a series of 3 conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch War saw Dutch and English fleets battle it out on the high seas for naval supremacy. It was against this backdrop in 1653 that the inhabitants of New Amsterdam decided to construct a defensive wall along the northern boundary of the settlement modern-day Wall Street to protect against potential attacks by English forces coming overland from New England to the north. Nevertheless, despite their best efforts to deter any would-be attacker in 1664, the English sent a small fleet to rest the entire colony of New Netherland and its capital of New Amsterdam. From Dutch-controlled Stuyvesant was unable to call on any resistance and consequently surrendered the city without a fight. The English renamed Fort Amsterdam as Fort James, and the wider colony of New Netherlanders, well as the actual settlement of New Amsterdam itself, as New York in honor of James the Duke of York, who would later become the future King James II. New York briefly fell under Dutch control again in 1673, but was quickly returned to the English under the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, which ended the series of hostilities between the two nations under English rule. New York continued to grow and prosper, fueled by a thriving economy and a steady influx of immigrants arriving from Europe. The city, however, retained many of its citizens' institutions and practices that were introduced by the Dutch, including the institution of slavery, which had become embedded in New York's economy through the shipment of slaves through the port. So much so that by the 1740s, some 20% of the residents of New York were slaves, totaling about 500 people. As the 18th century progressed, New York emerged as a center of political and cultural change. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, the city served as a hub for the dissident organization called the Sons of Liberty, who targeted the sizable portion of New York's population who were fervent royalists. Similarly, the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 was convened in New York to unite the American colonies in opposition to the Stamp Act introduced by the British government. This articulated the grievances and taxation rights of the 13 colonies, which ultimately laid the ideological framework for revolution and the subsequent Declaration of Independence. During the War of Independence, New York City continued to play a pivotal role. Whilst it was initially occupied by the forces of the Continental Army, when war broke out in 1775, the Battle of Long Island, which was fought in August of the following year, saw the American forces under General George Washington suffer a crushing defeat at the hands of the British. The subsequent occupation of New York by British forces would last for the duration of the war, with the city serving as the strategic base for their military operations across the country by 1783. However, the war was ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and the British began to evacuate their forces from the city, bringing an end to nearly a decade of occupation, which resulted in New York emerging as a shining light of liberty in the new American nation. In January 1785, New York was chosen to be the new national capital and played host to some of the most important events in the nation's early history, with the first President, George Washington, being inaugurated at Federal Hall in April 1789 as well. as the first Congress being formed and the Bill of Rights being drafted all in the same building on present-day Wall Street. With the dawning of the 19th century, New York had emerged as a global center of finance and banking, with Wall Street and lower Manhattan being home to the Bank of New York, which was founded by Alexander Hamilton back in 1784 as well as the New York Stock Exchange, which was set up in 1792, similarly as the early 1800s progressed. New York continued to prosper as a center of trade and commerce, with the construction of the Erie Canal linking the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. Completed in 1825, the canal transformed New York into the nation's premier port, overtaking the likes of Boston and Philadelphia in both importance and capacity. As the city continued to grow in size, New York underwent a dramatic transformation as waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia swelled its population from 60 in 18 to well over 500,000. By the middle of the century, newcomers fleeing poverty, persecution, and political upheaval arrived in New York City in search of opportunity and a fresh start, thus transforming the city into a vibrant melting pot of cultures and ethnicities. The number of inhabitants within the city was also furthered by the abolition of slavery within the state of New York in 1827, leading to an influx of freed African Americans. The Lower East Side in particular became a focal point of immigrant life, with crowded tenements and bustling marketplaces teeming with new arrivals from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and China. However, with this dramatic increase in population came unintended consequences. The overcrowded living conditions were hotbeds for diseases such as cholera, which broke out multiple times, beginning in the 1830s, and many of the packed tenement buildings were destroyed in the Great Fire of New York in 1835, which leveled some 50 acres of the city. Other poor and overcrowded neighborhoods, such as the Five Points and Hell's Kitchen, also had their share of poverty-related problems, with notorious criminal gangs, such as the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys, roaming the streets and resorting to petty theft, robbery, and violence. To make ends meet, the city's problems continued with the outbreak of the American Civil War, which engulfed the country in 1861. Although New York State was firmly part of the Union, the city's strong commercial ties to the South, coupled with its growing immigrant population and anger over conscription led to divided sympathies. The New York Draft Riot of 1863 broke out over the resentment towards wealthy men being able to buy their way out of conscription, and the resulting five-day riot marked one of the worst incidents of civil unrest in American history. Following the war, New York City entered somewhat of a cultural boom. Central Park, which opened to the public back in 1858, provided a green oasis and recreational space for all New Yorkers to enjoy. Meanwhile, the theaters of Broadway and the concert halls of Carnegie Hall played host to a dazzling array of performers and productions, cementing the city's reputation as the cultural capital of the nations. Similarly, New York saw the founding of several museums and libraries during this time, with the American Museum of Natural History being founded in 1869, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opening in 1870, and the New York Public Library being established in 1895. The increase in cultural offerings also saw journalism flourish, with newspapers like the New York Times, New York Herald, and New York World playing major roles in shaping public opinion, and the city itself becoming a national hub for the media industry. New York's continuing expansion further northward up the island of Manhattan, as well as development of connections into the neighboring towns over on Long Island, spurred the development of infrastructure projects such as the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883. Then in 1886, perhaps New York's most Iconic and defining landmark was gifted to the city by the nation of France. The Statue of Liberty was sited in the middle of New York Harbor and served as a beacon of hope to the millions of immigrants arriving on its shores before many of them were to pass through the Immigration Office, established on Ellis Island in 1892, and then onto new lives in America. The rapid scale of development within the city continued well into the following 20th century, with the New York City subway opening in 1904, connecting City Hall to Harlem and Brooklyn. The city skyline also saw its share of development during this time, with the likes of the Williamsburg and the Manhattan Bridge, opening in 1903 and 1909 respectively. These feats were only outdone in scale by the competitive efforts of architects and developers who wished to build the tallest and most extravagant buildings in the world, which resulted in the iconic silhouettes of skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, being topped off by the early 1930s, which proudly displayed the city's economic and architectural confidence to the world. Meanwhile, below ground, speakeasies and jazzers and airmen found themselves embarking on huge ocean liners out of New York stocks that carried them on their journey to the front lines. The post-war years saw New York transform into the city that it is today. While many of the world's other great cities lay in ruins, New York emerged with new global prominence. It became the home of the United Nations headquarters in 1952 and inherited Paris's role as the center of the global art world, as well as becoming a rival to London's financial markets by the 1960s. Although during the 1970s, the city became notorious for its levels of crime and deprivation, efforts to modernize and rejuvenate saw many of the older pre-war buildings redeveloped or torn down to make way for modern glass and steel constructions, such as the World Trade Center, which was completed in 1973. Since then, like all cities, New Yorkers continued to experience its fair share of trials and tribulations. What makes New York perhaps the greatest city in the world, however, is that no matter how many times it has been knocked down and set back, it has been able to pull itself back up and reinvent itself in such a way that perhaps many other cities of the world would struggle to achieve throughout its 400-year history. The city has constantly evolved and developed time and time again, to the point now where it is completely unrecognizable from that small Dutch settlement that it started out as all those years ago.